going to be a change of regime in the United States, but how is this really going to impact business both in America and also in India? Who better than Mukesh Aghi to join us from the USIBC right here on ET Now. Thanks very much for being with us. You are a regular visitor to India now, and I must ask you this question, that in your latest letter that you've written to President Obama, you've said that relations between US and India are at an all-time high, given the 4 visits and the 4 trips that Prime Minister Modi has made to the US in the last 2 odd years. Where are you seeing a lot of positive traction, and is this the new engagement that we are seeing between the 2 democracies? I mean, one of the largest and one of the oldest, really.
Well, I think if you look at the India-US relationship, last almost 70 years, they've never been more aligned strategically, tactically than now. If you look at geopolitically, I think India is becoming a great economic power and is aligned from that perspective in partnership with the US itself. I think economically there's a $100 billion trade which we're targeting to take it to $500 billion.
True.
And there are what I call is more and more synergy happening between the 2 countries. And then I think culturally we are the same people, open, democracy, very vibrant, we challenge each other. So I think from all aspects these 2 countries are aligned very well.
Mr. Aghi, you will agree with me when I say that a lot of that momentum, a lot of that camaraderie has had to do with the fact that seemingly President Obama and Prime Minister Modi do share a rapport of sorts. Do you believe that momentum can continue even after Mr. Obama does demit office?
I believe so, because it is not just based on personal relationship, this partnership. It's because the nation's interests are aligned between the 2 countries. You look at, we had before this President Bush, he drove the civil nuclear deal. Before that was a Democratic President Clinton.
That's right.
And whoever comes in next, I think things will get more and more aligned.
Whoever comes in next is the question I have in mind, and I'm going to go to that in just a bit. But what do you believe has changed this time around? When you say that Indo-US relations are at an all-time high, what has changed this time around? Like you rightly said, President Bush did push the civil nuclear deal, and they seemingly shared a good rapport even with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh or the previous regime, really. What has been the catalyst this time around?
I think a couple of things. One is I think Prime Minister Modi has taken a much more proactive business approach into this relationship. He has focused a lot on FDI. And if you look at the stats, as he goes to any country, the FDI from the country into India picks up. So I think that has, and he has engaged the business community very much. And in the US, it's the lobbies which make a lot of difference on the policy side, on the legislative side. And I think US business community is very high on Prime Minister Modi. So that has made the big difference itself.
So the right noises as far as the business community is concerned. I want to get down to the specifics and talk to you about the FDI reforms that you mentioned. A lot of people, when they look at the Modi regime, I'm going to just step back and take some big picture questions before I get down to opening up of defense or for that matter, civil aviation, pharma and all of that. A lot of people, when you speak to them, whether they're from the US or other parts of the world, they say that Mr. Modi did come to power with a stunning majority. He was obviously riding a wave of expectations, but he hasn't delivered at that pace. For obvious reasons, we're not China, we can't roughshod the opposition. There is a seeming resistance in the upper house of Indian Parliament where legislation is blocked. How do you assess the last 2 years and the pace of reforms that have happened?
Well, obviously expectations are very high. But I think from our perspective, we believe that we never expected big bang reforms. We expected more of a salami approach, one slice at a time. And I think from that perspective, this government seems to be delivering. Every time you see more and more changes happening. If you look at on the ease of doing business, things have improved. They're not still the world class, but they've improved. I mean, the World Bank rated India logistic environment from 54th to 35th, 19 spots improvement.
That's right.
So I think we are seeing gradual shift taking place in a positive way. And the expectation, as we said, within the US companies also, that don't expect big bang reforms, but do expect gradual reform itself.
So have US companies made their peace with the fact that reforms in India are going to be built by consensus? They will be slow, they will be gradual, they won't be big bang?
I would say yes and no both. A yes from the perspective, they realize that this is a democracy. A prime minister has to build a consensus. He does not have the majority in the upper house.
That's right.
So I think those expectations have been set. But U.S. businesses are measured like any other environment on a quarterly basis.
That's right.
There's a sense of urgency, there's a sense of getting better ROI. So you keep on seeing, expectations still being high, but accepting that reforms will be gradual, which is fine.
Gradual reforms are fine as long as they never go back. And I think what India has done is they've reformed, and those reforms haven't been upturned like it happens in other parts of the world, even though we are a noisy democracy. One of the figures that I was going through, and the USIBC has recently said that its members have the scope to invest about $45 billion in India, and the fact that FDI has been further liberalized is giving you a lot of scope. Where do you see the scope? I mean, FDI, of course, has been liberalized in sectors like aviation, defense, where big money hasn't really flown in. Do you see the change happen now?
Well, first is I think our member companies, when the Prime Minister was here in Washington, D.C., made a commitment of investing $45 billion in next 2 or 3 years. And if you look at those investments are happening more in the technology area, in the media area. We're not seeing much investment coming in the infrastructure area.
That's right.
And I think that's where the large pension funds, the large insurance company, which look at investing 20, 30 years, are still wait and watch environment. They would like to see that there's more transparency, there's more predictability, because they're focusing next 20 years. And I believe that they are getting more and more comfortable, and you'll see some shift taking place in the next 12 to 24 months in the infrastructure investment also.
What is making them comfortable?
I think what they're saying is there's more predictability.
Okay.
They're saying that there's more transparency. In the recent round of reforms also, there was a lot of consultative process which USIBC got engaged and got its members involved, also giving feedback to the government. So I think from that perspective, what we're seeing is a sense of predictability is coming through.
If I want to get down to the specifics, and I think one of the areas where India expects the U.S. companies to invest in and to park their top dollar, other than the infrastructure and, the pension funds getting in, is the fact that they've opened up floodgates for defense FDI. And it is no secret that defense companies would not put their money if they did not have complete control. With 100% FDI in defense, do you see the big guns from the U.S. now come to India? And if they don't, what could be the resistance?
I think there are two aspects. One is the company's policy of coming fast enough, but they also have to deal with the U.S. regulation of control of technology going out of India.
Okay.
I think that's where the biggest constraint is today. I mean, say if you talk to Boeing, if you talk to Lockheed, they would love to move the F-16, F-18 production into India itself, but they still have to go through the process of getting DOD and State Department technology transfer approval before they can move in. So that's a little complex, but the intent from the corporate side is they'd like to move in fast enough and bring in Make in India in the defense area.
So while the corporates may be comfortable, is the U.S. government open enough now to let the technology transfer happen?
I think, when you say government, you got two broad aspects of the government there. One is definitely the administrative side, but then you also have the legislative side. Because a lot of rules have been put in by legislative side, which the government has to go through jumping the hoops to make sure they get the clearance. And that's where USIBC is working both with the U.S. government and also on the legislative side to make sure that the reforms, at least the laws, are in favor of having transfer technology taking place in India. That will take some time.
Right. I also want to turn focus and talk to you about Indian pharma, because I think there's been some amount of discomfort there, and a lot of Indian pharma companies believe that they're at the receiving end of the U.S. Food and Drug Regulator. Now, what is causing this discomfort? Is the quality standard not good enough? Because India really is the pharmacy of the United States.
It is. In fact, if you look at the generic market from India to the U.S.,
right,
is roughly Indian companies control slightly over 30% of generic market.
Yeah.
And more important is they bring savings to the U.S. government of over $20 billion. I think it is good for the Indian companies that the FDA standards are imposed in India on the shop floor, on the factory, on the research, because they become world-class entities itself. So yes, there are issues, there are challenges, but if you meet the FDA standard, it's good for the Indian companies and it was also good for the U.S. consumer.
You know, one of the other teething troubles that one is seeing is the IPR and the visa issue, and allow me to take it one by one. If I may touch upon IPR first, India has defended its right to issue compulsory licenses. Now, how are you going to deal with this? Because this is obviously going to be a big issue with pharma companies going forward.
Well, India is a sovereign country. It has to look after its people. And I think it's a sovereign right for India, in case of crisis, to be able to use that compulsory license. But at the same time, if you look at last 22 or 24 months of this government, they've not issued any compulsory license.
They haven't so far.
So I think what the message we are getting is we'll protect the IP of the U.S. pharma companies, but we still retain the right to use their license if the need requires. And I think that's fair.
The other issue, and I think I'm sure the tech titans keep approaching you for this, is the visa issue. There was a bipartisan bill that was passed on H-1B visas. The visa fee was hiked very recently. Where are we on this visa issue? Because a lot of people are now beginning to get concerned about, people would initially say it's rhetoric, it's pure election rhetoric, but now we are seeing action on the ground which is contrary to what the U.S. stance of opening up economies have been.
Well, our position on the H-1B visa, in fact, today I did come up with an article on that in one of the newspapers,
right,
is that the current extra fee which U.S. government has put in on the Indian company is discriminatory. And I think we have stated that very clearly to the government itself, mainly to the legislative side.
Right.
I think the problem is that the H-1B issue get caught up in the other 11 million undocumented workers in the U.S.
Right.
And that's where the politicians are making this a political football and kicking the whole thing back and forth. I think once the elections are over, I believe you'll see the noise settle down, and they'll realize, the U.S. Government will realize that it needs the H-1B visa, employees to come in and support the U.S. companies, because without them, the U.S. companies will not be competitive on a global basis.
I was going to ask you a follow-up question on, does this lead to a rise of protectionist stance? And I will come to that in just a bit. But if there were 2 or 3 things on your wish list, yes, the government is in the reform mode, they are reforming, but if there were 2 or 3 things on your wish list as far as the government of India is concerned, what would those be? What are the boxes that you would still want them to tick?
I think be more predictable in the policy making, make sure it's much more consultative, and get both the Indian companies and the investors from the U.S. involved in the process itself, and be more transparent in issuing policy. I think what we are seeing is on the senior level of the bureaucracy, that seems to go well. Somehow this has to percolate down to the middle and the lower level. I think that's going to take some time, and we're hopeful that it'll come through.
Top of the world with Times Network. And you're watching ET Now.
I also want to ask you a question on India's legislative logjam. And I think Prime Minister made light of it when he was in the US, saying how bipartisan the Senate and the Congress are in the US. But if I may ask you, the kind of legislative logjam that we are seeing in India, and the kind of reforms that are stuck due to it, GST for one, all hopes pinned on that. We've had global investors come on our channel and say that if GST were to pass through, there will be more inflows into India. Are you concerned about the kind of political acrimony that's holding up those decisions?
No, and I'll tell you why. I think...
You draw comfort from what they do back home?
Well, U.S. is worse. if you look at...
you almost locked down the budget, yes.
Absolutely. Forget that. You have a nomination for a Supreme Court justice.
Right.
And the Republican Party is refusing to entertain that issue.
True.
So I think the logjam in the U.S. is much worse than here. At least the Parliament got together and passed a lot of legislation in the last 2 years than what we've seen in the U.S.
So there's still hope that's flying in the air.
Absolutely.
I also want to quickly touch upon a topic that a lot of market participants would want to know, not strictly corporate really, but there is a lot of speculation that when will Janet Yellen, hike interest rates? Brexit has happened. Has she put the pause button? Is the economy not in a good enough shape? As an insider, and I call you a global insider because I treat you as an insider both in India and overseas in the US, when do you think she's going to push the button on rate hikes? Because that is going to result in a lot of outflows from India.
It is tough to say, and I'll tell you why. You know, you had Brexit, and everybody saw that as, okay, nothing's going to happen. Suddenly, a week later, U.S. announced almost 260,000 new jobs being created.
Right.
That moved the momentum the other direction. I think my gut feeling is nothing is going to happen until after the election.
Not for a while.
Not for a while.
I will touch upon elections in just a bit, but I think because you represent U.S. corporates and you represent the sentiment that some of our actions create in the U.S., I must ask you, recently we did see, you know, intellectuals like a Raghuram Rajan or an Arvind Subramanian, other very scathing personal attack from a certain parliamentarian. What is the kind of, if I may say, what is the kind of message does the U.S. draw from something like this?
Well, you know, it happens in the U.S. also. I mean, to look at what's happening between the two presidential candidates, kind of remarks they make for each other, for other candidates. I think, you know, somebody like Governor Raghuram is a well-respected global economist, and I think that gave a lot of assurance to global investors. But, you know, a country, a nation just does not depend on one single individual. It's an entity, and I think you have much more smarter people or the same as him who will replace him, and life goes on.
Life certainly goes on, but does it make advocacy of, you know, business ties difficult for people like yourselves? I mean, here you are, celebrated economists, under constant attack from one single individual. Does that, and you know, on issues of what? On issues of having a green card, but that's a requirement if you're working in the U.S. On issues of what? Of being level CIA agent. I mean, you know, these are seemingly very disturbing trends, aren't they?
Well, I think it's petty, but at the same time, I think as a businessman representing large companies from the U.S. itself, you know, you just take these blows and move on.
My last question before I wrap things up, you know, globalization was the big trend that the world saw, and the world, I think, benefited a large from the globalization trend, the global trade pie. But that global trade pie is shrinking. We are seeing hyper-nationalism, very protectionist stance, especially after the Brexit vote. How are things looking in the U.S.? Are we going to see further rise of hyper-nationalism with Mr. Trump in the fray and saying the kind of things that he has to?
Well, I think it's not just Mr. Trump. If you look at the manifesto released by the Democratic Party,
right.
It is a cause of concern. And the trend seemed to be close the borders, try to basically have closed economy. You look at what happened in UK. You look at what's happening in other part of the world also.
Right.
What we're seeing is a more of a rightist sentiments coming up,
True.
Which does not believe in international global trade. I mean, say, for Trump to say he'll build a wall with Mexico.
True.
TPP, both parties seem to have rejected. So I think that is a cause of concern, and I think it's not good for business, because business is more global nowadays, and to reverse that is going to be damaging for consumers, for businesses, and for nations.
But we are seeing the realities of that being reversed. Nobody thought Brexit is going to be a reality, but look at how UK has voted. So my question to you is that how do businesses survive this sentiment? And will countries like India that have greatly benefited from globalization, but at the other end of the spectrum, be at the receiving end of what the developed world could perhaps do?
Well, I think first thing I have to say is if you look back in the last 50 years, no global economy has grown if they don't have an export-led economy.
Yes,
Look at the United States, look at Japan, look at Korea, look at China. And so it's India's turn. And so I think India has to stay focused on driving what he calls export-led economy. It is cause of concern because of the technology shifting, automation coming in, you'll see less and less jobs coming in from an export perspective also and from a domestic perspective.
True.
So I think our role is to make sure that the global order which was built, yes, it'll get fine-tuned as more powers come in, but I think if you start closing the borders, it's going to be damaging to all economies, to all consumers, and to a lot of nations.
But are businesses working on the proposition that this could be a reality? Are they going back to the drawing board? Are they re-strategizing just yet?
Some are not. But most of them are still focused on driving
Which are the ones
global
that
growth.
are doing so?
I think what's interesting is if you look at the technology side, they seem to be very global. I mean, so you look at
They'll go to where the
Uber,
best talent is.
yeah, best talent is. They don't have to worry about visas over the net. They can move in technology, people work through it. I think what we're seeing is more on the primary stuff where it's getting more border closed. On the food side, for example, people are tending to make sure that we are self-sufficient, and so they are trying to move in that direction. On the defense side, I think the U.S. is still pushing global defense. It is the largest supplier of weapons. But I think I would say the shift is very minimal, but I think it's still taking place.
Britons have shocked the world by deciding to exit the European Union, and many people believe better sense should have prevailed. But what about Americans? Could they do a Britain on the world? Could Donald Trump actually be heading to the Oval Office?
Well, voters will surprise you. Nobody expected Donald Trump to beat other 15 Republican candidates and get him nominated. So I won't be surprised. But I think now Mr. Trump has to go after the general voters, and he has to change his stance. And he's having difficulty from that perspective. So my feeling is it's all for potential President Hillary Clinton to come in and be the next president of the country.
So the first woman president in the history of the United States. What is Ms. Clinton's occupation of Oval Office really going to mean for India, according to you?
I think if you say what will she do first 100 days as a president,
right.
I think she will reach out to the Congress. She is one person, along with her husband, who have shown they can go across the line and talk to the opposition. So I think we'll see that happening. I think she will drive a very strong domestic agenda. I think for India, it is a positive news because she knows India. She has a large Indian support structure in her campaign.
True.
And I think she has a lot of positive feelings about India. So I think you'll see it'll be good for India from that perspective if she becomes a president.
And a Democrat is always better news for India than a Republican ever will, on most occasions.
Yeah, well, we had President Bush, who was a very gung-ho on India. I think President Clinton was very strong on India. President Obama has been strong. I think President Hillary Clinton will be very, very strong.
So from one Clinton to the other, we do hope good times return to India.
I hope so. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Top of the world with Times Network. And you're watching ET Now.